On her 10th birthday, Victoria Martens should have been blowing out her birthday candles and making a wish, surrounded by people and friends that she loved. Instead, she died in one of the most disturbing, horrific murders you will ever hear, and I do not make that claim lightly. As an avid true crime watcher and someone that was truly devastated by the Gabriel Fernandez story, I cannot believe that I had not heard of this tragedy before, and I'm sure that many of you will find that it's new to you too. This little girl was found killed, in pieces, burned, and hidden in a bathtub, and some of the people that were arrested for her murder weren't even in the apartment when she died. So how on earth could something like this have happened to Victoria, and why? Today we're going to talk about the flawed investigation, the false confessions, gaps in the system, and we have an interview that you are going to want to stay and listen for. Get ready, everyone, because Victoria Martens' case will definitely break your heart. I am cautioning you now that this is going to be very graphic, so please proceed with caution. Welcome to the True Crime Nurse, everyone. My name is Kat, and I'm a registered nurse who loves all things nursing and true crime. Please be sure to like, subscribe, and comment down below any cases that you want me to look into. All right, everyone, let's get started. Victoria Ann Martens was born on August 23rd, 2006 in Albuquerque, New Mexico. She lived with her mother, Michelle Martens, and a younger brother in a West Side apartment. Her brother, Matthew, wasn't there all the time, though, as he primarily lived with his father. Michelle, a single mother originally from the Bronx, New York, had recently moved to Albuquerque and started working at a local grocery store, proud to have actually passed the drug test that was required to get that job. Victoria was a normal, happy, bright child. She loved school, had friends, and was described by neighbors as happy, helpful, and just a sweet little girl. Her bedroom was decorated with school projects and pictures, and her friends remembered her as someone that loved to attend a good birthday party and play some neighborhood games with friends. To her community and family, Victoria was the picture of an ordinary, loving child. Her home life, however, was very troubled. And this is something that I can personally connect with, so please forgive me in advance if I get emotional in this video. Michelle struggled financially, and the apartment that they lived in was really small and crowded. According to court records and interviews, Michelle had a history of tumultuous relationships and drug use. In mid-2016, she began dating a man named Fabian Gonzalez, a 31-year-old man that she met online on a dating website called Plenty of Fish just weeks before this tragedy took place. Fabian moved into the Martens' apartment in August of 2016, shortly before Victoria's birthday, which to me is already a red flag, guys. You barely know this man and you're bringing him around your children that quickly? I digress, though, because I know circumstances are different for everyone. Around the same time, his cousin Jessica Kelly, who had a criminal past and had been released from prison only days earlier, also came to stay with the family in that little apartment. This created a volatile household. Michelle's vulnerable position was exploited by Fabian, who soon began bringing other men and drugs into the home. During 2015 to 2016, authorities have been alerted to the potential problems in the Martens' home. The New Mexico Children, Youth, and Families Department, or CYFD, received five separate calls about the welfare of Victoria and her brother. Many of those calls came from Michelle herself, accusing her ex-husband, the children's father, of neglect. CYFD workers say that they thoroughly investigated each report for issues like poor hygiene or inadequate babysitting and found no provable harm towards the children. In March of 2016, a caller claimed that Michelle's then-boyfriend had tried to kiss Victoria. You heard that right. Under New Mexico law, CYFD couldn't treat that as child maltreatment unless a caregiver actually harmed a child, so they passed it off to the police. An Albuquerque Police Department, or APD, spokesman later noted that, quote, someone attempting something like kissing the child is not a crime, end quote, and no charges were filed. I feel like I can hear your collective frustration and yelling at the screen right now, and honestly, I'm there with you. In the end, state investigators will conclude that none of those earlier reports had clear evidence of harm, but critics would later argue that warning signs were missed that may have saved Victoria's life. Despite those alarming events, though, Victoria's life appeared totally normal to the outside world. Neighbors said that she loved to dance and play and that Michelle doted on her children, until Fabian arrived. One neighbor said that Victoria was inviting everybody to her birthday party and she was such a sweet little girl around the neighborhood. It seemed, for a time, that Michelle was a caring mom. Victoria was just a vulnerable 10-year-old girl caught in a troubled family situation. She attended Petroglyph Elementary School in Albuquerque and had just begun 5th grade. She celebrated a happy 9th birthday just the year before and was looking forward to turning 10. Friends and family described her as a loving daughter and a caring sibling, but beneath the surface, Michelle's actions would unravel and tell a story that is going to infuriate you. In the months before the murder, police later learned that she had been soliciting strangers online to use her children for whatever they wanted, if you know what I mean. Her children. This horrifying information would come out during the investigation, painting an alarming picture of Victoria's true home life. It was a house of horrors. By August 2016, Victoria's world had really become unstable. The new adults in her life, Fabian Gonzalez, Jessica Kelly, and her mom, were heavy users of methamphetamines and associates in Albuquerque's underworld. Fabian, her boyfriend, quickly assumed authority in the home. Court testimony would describe him telling Michelle, quote, "I am the man of this house," and taking on a dominant role over everything, especially the kids. Jessica, Fabian's cousin, was paranoid and erratic, often staying in Victoria's room for hours. Both brought a stream of new people into the apartment, which put the children in harm's way, obviously. In late August 2016, Fabian charged Jessica $50 a week rent to stay at the apartment, which was unknown to Michelle at the time. Victoria's life revolved around routines at school and neighborhood games, but her afternoons were increasingly dictated by these new adults in her life. Neighbors later remembered that Jessica had been around during the week leading up to Victoria's birthday, sometimes chasing Victoria with sticks or acting strangely. Others saw Victoria's mother and Fabian openly using drugs in the apartment hallways. Yet the 10-year-old tried to remain happy and cheerful, even helping a neighbor do laundry or do chores in exchange for popsicles. The innocence and vulnerability of her truly breaks my heart. Her grandparents, who lived elsewhere in Albuquerque, tried to monitor the situation, but Victoria's mother often kept the children from them, insisting that there was no problem. By the night of August 23rd, the family's dysfunction reached an all-time high. Michelle and Fabian spent most of the day away from home, hunting for drugs and alcohol, leaving Victoria and Jessica alone on their own. Text messages from that day show Michelle trying to arrange another adult to check on the apartment and pick up Victoria from school, but ultimately trusting Fabian's idea that Jessica could handle it. In the end, Victoria and her younger brother returned to an apartment with strangers rather than a safe, present parent. Victoria's 10th birthday began like any other day. At around 7:30 in the morning, she got on the school bus near the apartment complex and then headed to Petroglyph Elementary, ready to spend the day with her friends. Neighbors later remembered seeing her smiling and chatting, holding tight to a small pile of birthday cards that she would later open at school. The morning passed with little contact between Victoria and the adults at home, and around 11:40 in the morning, Michelle and Fabian left the apartment together to again buy substances from a friend. That friend warned them over the phone that Jessica Kelly, quote, should not be in the apartment and was acting weird, having hallucinations and hearing the devil's commands from an EBT card pin pad. Fabian ignored the warning, though. The couple returned briefly, only to leave again around 2:30 to buy alcohol. Before leaving, Michelle texted a neighbor to knock on the door, pretend to be her aunt, and make sure everything was okay, showing that she was clearly uneasy about leaving them home alone. She also messaged her own mother to pick up Victoria from the bus, which was an arrangement that Fabian talked her out of, convincing her, quote, that it was safe to leave Victoria with Jessica, end quote. Between 3 to about 4:40, Fabian and Michelle stayed at a friend's house doing more drugs, ignoring calls, and a neighbor actually texted Michelle at 4:30 p.m. saying that Victoria had returned from school and needed attention. Only then did Fabian and Michelle drive back to their apartment, returning by 5. That evening, around 6:08 p.m., Fabian left again. He told police that he took Victoria to buy a soda at a nearby gas station without her mom's knowledge. For a brief moment, it seemed like a normal parent-child errand, and neighbors smiled at seeing Victoria tagging along with her so-called stepdad. When they returned at about 6:15 p.m., neither Michelle nor Fabian asked any questions. Fabian even gave Victoria cash, $45 for her birthday, and then took her into a back room to talk to her privately, which this behavior was described as controlling by jurors later on. After Fabian and Michelle left again about 7:01 p.m. to get more substances from Fabian's brother, they actually had a short argument. Then they left the apartment for a final time at 7:32 p.m. Fabian's cell phone pinged, locations outside the complex just minutes after he and Michelle were gone, leaving Victoria alone with Jessica Kelly. This was the last time that any of the adults would see Victoria alive. That late summer evening, something terrible happened. Between 7:45 p.m. and 8:45 on the night of August 23rd, an unidentified intruder entered the apartment and brutally murdered Victoria. The stranger told Jessica he was looking for Favo, Fabian's nickname, and then killed the child in her bedroom as retaliation. He threatened Jessica afterward. If she and Fabian didn't clean up the mess, he would harm her next. After committing the atrocity, the killer fled, and to this day, law enforcement has never publicly identified him. In police reports, he is simply referred to as John Doe, a fourth suspect known only by DNA left at the crime scene that day. But don't go just yet. There's a lot more we need to talk about, including a very important interview. In the hours after the murder, Fabian and Michelle were unaware of what happened. Cell phone records showed that they were still out and about while this occurred. It was Michelle's phone pings that confirmed that she was not at the apartment when the crime occurred. Only after 8:48 p.m., when the pair returned home, high and paranoid, did their nightmare begin. That evening, first neighbors and then police would discover the full horror of what happened while they were gone. Around 4:30 a.m. on August 24, 2016, police responded to the 911 call at the apartment. Fabian and Michelle, fearing Jessica had attacked them with an iron, had already fled down the hallway to a neighbor's apartment to call for help. When officers entered the Martens unit, though, they were met by a scene of unspeakable horror. In a narrow bathroom, Victoria's lifeless body was found partially wrapped in a burning blanket in the bathtub. Her body had been taken apart, if you know what I mean. A blanket covered her torso, and her arms and legs had been removed. Smoke billowed from a sheet lying over her remains. One detective later told reporters that he sent gut-wrenching text messages to colleagues saying, quote, "This is the worst thing I've ever been to. What is going on?" end quote. The first responders described it as the most grotesque thing they had ever encountered. Paramedics pronounced Victoria dead at the scene. They couldn't save her. Investigators would later catalog horrifying details. The bathtub had been used to dispose of and burn her body parts. The smoke detectors in the bathroom had been removed, and blood evidence suggested that her body had been dragged and left in several places throughout that apartment. A knife with partial blood matching Victoria's was found in the kitchen, and organs that had been wrapped in trash bags were found in the living room. Evidence indicated that Fabian and Jessica themselves had later cleaned up the apartment. They were seen dragging Victoria's body out of her room, through the kitchen and into the bathroom, then removing her organs from the tub and placing them in a laundry hamper. Included in some of the crime scene photos were shredded birthday cards and scattered food, hinting at a desperate last attempt for someone to do something for her birthday until it was tragically destroyed. Forensic investigators processed the scene with heavy hearts, and I cannot imagine how difficult this must have been. When the autopsy was finally completed in November of 2016, the findings were both devastating and confusing. Victoria had suffered extensive violence. The medical examiner found that she had been strangled to death, stabbed, and then taken apart. The pathologist noted penetrating trauma to her rectum, which is evidence consistent with being essayed. Her body showed over a dozen separate wounds and cuts. As if that's not horrifying enough, all this destruction was sealed by fire. Victoria's body had been wrapped in plastic and set on fire in the bathroom, with those smoke detectors purposefully disabled to avoid help from showing up. If that isn't evil and show intent, I don't know what possibly could. The autopsy found no drugs or alcohol in Victoria's system, which contradicted Michelle's initial story that she had given Victoria methamphetamines to calm her down and subdue her for sexual purposes. I want to take a second here to make sure that you understand you did hear that correctly. Michelle claimed she drugged Victoria to subdue her to perform sexual acts. She is 10, and she literally advertised her children to do things like this for money and drugs online. But the autopsy didn't align with that claim that was made by Michelle. It did, however, reveal something shocking. Victoria had been carrying a sexually transmitted disease, which is gut-wrenching because it clues you in on what this innocent 10-year-old child had endured. The crime scene was unspeakably cruel. Victoria Martens' remains showed every kind of violence imaginable: blunt force trauma, strangulation, sharp force stabbing wounds, and sexual violence, followed by taking apart her body and then lighting her on fire. The medical investigator concluded that her cause of death was manual strangulation, but the condition of her body spoke far more than that. A 10-year-old's limbs were wrapped in a child's blanket and burnt in the tub. The case drew national headlines as, quote, one of New Mexico's worst child murders, and I would argue that it stretches far beyond New Mexico. It is truly one of the worst cases I've ever heard. Within hours of this grisly discovery, there were 3 arrests made. Present in the apartment were Victoria's mother, Michelle Martens, Michelle's boyfriend, Fabian Gonzalez, and Fabian's cousin, Jessica Kelly. All 3 were described by police as shocked and frightened. In the back of squad cars, they all claimed their innocence, each with very different stories of what happened that night. The Albuquerque Police Department immediately charged each of them with first-degree murder, child violence, and additional related offenses. They were booked into jail on million-dollar bonds each and arraigned the next day. They all pled not guilty. Authorities announced that all three were co-defendants, and prosecutors intended to try them separately due to the complexity of the evidence. In the initial chaos, Michelle Martens told police a version of events that would later prove false. Surprise, surprise. At first, she said that she had been asleep when an argument suddenly woke her, that she and Fabian had been attacked by Jessica, who, quote, looked at them with crazy eyes and then beat them with an iron while saying she had hurt Victoria. Fabian and Jessica's stories initially matched this general outline. Fabian told detectives that he awoke to screaming, chased Jessica out of the apartment, and saw Kelly stabbing and hacking at Victoria with a knife. He also claimed that he and Michelle were intimate several times after this, which makes me honestly want to throw up. Meanwhile, Jessica claimed that she had found Victoria's body and panicked, but then set her on fire with alcohol to destroy the evidence. I understand that they were all under the influence, but if you didn't do anything wrong, why are you trying to hide evidence? As investigators worked through the day, though, an even darker portrait was painted, although that's honestly hard to imagine at this point. In several interviews, Michelle changed her story countless times. At one point, she tearfully stated that she had watched as Fabian and Jessica forced themselves sexually on her daughter and then cut her up. These graphic accusations stunned her own family members who sat crying in the courtroom. Yet evidence began to contradict these statements almost immediately. The medical findings of no drugs in Victoria's system clashed with Michelle's claim that she had given her meth, which we had already touched on earlier, and surveillance video and cell phone data placed Michelle away from the apartment during the critical hours. Jessica and Fabian also altered their stories as the investigation continued. Phone records revealed that all three suspects had been talking extensively to each other and others before and after the murder, contrary to what they all claimed. By late 2017, forensic testing would rule out Fabian's DNA on any of Victoria's wounds, and they dropped the charge of NSA against Jessica. The prosecution realized that they couldn't prove during the trial that Fabian or Jessica had forced themselves on Victoria, so those charges were quietly dismissed. This was really hard to hear because there was physical evidence and the diagnosis of the STD that explains what happened to her. By the time the bail hearing started, it was clear that this case was going to be anything but straightforward. News reports stated that there was supposedly some protective uncle who was nowhere near the bathroom at the time, a mother with at least some involvement, and a cousin who insisted that 3 other people were also involved. Publicly, the police kept pursuing the 3 in custody as if all were equally culpable, but behind the scenes, prosecutors were trying to figure out who the true mastermind was. What began as a clear case of filicide by 3 adults was unraveling into something much darker. As detectives dug deeper, it became apparent that much of the early narrative, especially from Michelle, was unreliable. Michelle's statements to police changed several times, according to the court documents. In one interview, she blamed Jessica alone. In another, she tearfully said that Fabian and Jessica together killed Victoria while she stood there and did nothing. In my opinion, she allowed them in the home, and if she stood by and watched and did nothing, blood's on her hands also. Investigators eventually concluded that Michelle's story was completely fabricated. A forensic psychiatrist hired by the DA found that Michelle had an exceptional amount of denial and very shallow levels of emotions in her interviews, which are traits making her susceptible to agreeing with investigators' leading questions. The experts noted that Michelle's intelligence level was low and that she tended to say whatever she thought that the investigators may want to hear. Over and over, she gave conflicting versions to try to make sense of her daughter's death, inadvertently incriminating herself one moment and then denying involvement in the next. For example, Michelle initially told police that just after midnight on August 24th, Jessica burst into the bedroom shouting that she had killed Victoria. Later, she claimed that she and Fabian had left Victoria with Jessica while buying drugs and returned to find the murder already done to her child. Still, later, Michelle confessed in that court, quote, "I watched Fabian and Jessica force themselves on my daughter," which was a very dramatic confession, but it also carried no evidence. I wish that we had the context to understand if she was seeking empathy or sympathy here or trying to blame them, but either way, it's just sick. None of this added up. Each dramatic detail that she supplied, the 4 sexual acts, drugging, multiple attackers, were all refuted by the evidence and testimony. As the DA's team later bluntly stated, most of what Michelle had said was simply not true and just a lie. By mid-2018, the inconsistencies could not be ignored. Prosecutors publicly declared that phone records proved that Michelle and Fabian were not present at the apartment when Victoria died, and that the DNA on her body pointed to a fourth person, which, if you remember, Jessica had claimed that already. In the courtroom, Michelle's attorney hinted that she had been too afraid of Fabian to protect her children and that her false statements were a result of manipulation. Ultimately, they arranged for her to accept a plea deal regarding child violence instead of murder, which came with a sentence of 12 years and 6 years credit. Throughout, the phrase false confession was used by officials, shocked to realize that this grieving mother had misled them into believing she was a witness to unspeakable violence on her child. In the eyes of pretty much everybody, Michelle's lies had endangered the search for Victoria's real killer. The crucial breakthrough, though, came in June of 2018 when DA Raul Torres revealed a bombshell finding. Cell phone ping data and DNA evidence unequivocally excluded both Michelle and Fabian from the murder scene. Torres said in a press conference that the call records proved that neither of them were home during the murder window and that Victoria's body contained DNA from a fourth unidentified male person. That mystery DNA made the unknown man, nicknamed John Doe, the only suspect that can actually be charged with her murder. All murder charges against Michelle and Fabian were dropped in light of this new evidence. Those of you that have been here for a while can probably guess how I feel about this. I am repulsed. Let me know in the comments how you feel about their charges being dropped too, because I know that this is going to be a controversial one. This revelation shifted the entire case. Michelle Martens, who had been the focus of investigators and initial trials, pleaded guilty on June 29, 2018, to one count of child harm resulting in death. Also super strange, side note, because I'm actually recording this on June 29th. Anyways, her guilty plea meant that she accepted responsibility for neglecting Victoria, but not killing her. Fabian's earlier charges, second-degree murder, forced sexual acts, were also dismissed, though he remained charged with lesser counts. The DA publicly stated, quote, "We were forced to consider the possibility that Michelle Martens had falsely incriminated herself and Fabian Gonzalez in this heinous act," end quote. Michelle's entire story was now discredited. The prosecutor stated, quote, "Statements about the part that she took in her daughter's death just didn't add up," end quote. With Michelle and Fabian cleared of active participation, the investigation refocused on two avenues, Jessica Kelly and the unknown man. For the first time, police were searching for a stranger. John Doe, the unidentified killer, was described as a male whose partial DNA profile was on file, but who had no known identity. Investigators could only say that he was not any of the male figures already involved with Victoria. Not her father, not the neighbors, Fabian, none of the cops on the scene either. Police released a generic composite sketch of a Hispanic male and asked for the public's help. But the trail grew cold. Unlike many high-profile cases, there was no confession or tip that led to any names. Detectives learned even more from Jessica's own revised story, though. By January 2019, Kelly had cut another deal. She pleaded no contest to reckless child harm resulting in death, which was a drastic reduction from murder. In exchange, the sexual violence and murder charges were dropped against her. In her plea hearing, Kelly told a new version. On the night of the murder, she had been high on methamphetamines, paranoid, and alone with Victoria. She claimed that an unknown man suddenly burst in and killed Victoria while she and the girl were in the room. Kelly then said that she panicked and followed the instructions of the killer, who she believed to be Fabian, to set Victoria's body on fire. Finally, Kelly agreed to testify in any trial against Fabian and the John Doe suspect. Prosecutors cited her cooperation when it came to her sentencing in 2022. So, after 2 years of investigation, the narrative had flipped completely upside down. The police and DA now believe two unknowns, not Fabian or Michelle, committed the murder. The real killer, John Doe, was still at large, and Jessica's limited culpability was in providing an alibi and cover-up rather than in committing the crime. Fabian insisted that he was innocent, but was taken to trial on child harm and evidence tampering charges, while the DA continued seeking whoever John Doe was. Michelle was to be sentenced for endangering Victoria by neglect. The adjustments in charges and suspects reflected how badly the original investigation had gone off the rails. During the early investigation, Jessica claimed to be a terrified witness, first telling cops that she came home to find Michelle injured and Victoria gone, then saying later that she never saw the murder at all. But investigators were still skeptical. Video surveillance from a nearby bus stop even showed Kelly casually picking up Victoria after school when Michelle and Fabian had failed to go get her. When the case stalled, DA Torres' office leveraged Kelly's knowledge of what happened. In January 2019, the prosecution struck a deal with Kelly. By then, the sexual violence charge was no longer on the table. Court records showed that Kelly confessed to being high on drugs while babysitting Victoria when an unknown man entered and killed the girl. She admitted that she then set her body on fire. She emphatically implicated a mysterious man but insisted she didn't kill Victoria. Kelly agreed to testify against Fabian Gonzalez and John Doe since her testimony was key to securing Fabian's conviction. In exchange, the DA dropped the murder count against her. Let me know your thoughts in the comments on this one, because once again, this feels like a lot of bargaining at Victoria's expense. When Kelly finally stood before Judge Cindy Leos in 2022 for sentencing, she received 50 years in prison with 6 years suspended, meaning that she will serve 44 years. She remains eligible for parole after half that time, but she will remain incarcerated for decades. By that point, Kelly had kept her side of the bargain. She had testified for prosecutors about the events that night that led to Victoria's final moments. In trial, she portrayed herself as a drug-addicted, frightened babysitter who got caught up in the aftermath. Whether her account was fully truthful or not is debatable, but legally, she was the closest thing that the DA had to a cooperative witness. Still, her role was significant in the story. She was the one who sat next to Victoria's body after the fact, who had set ablaze to it, and who alone testified to the final sequence of the crime. Police reports note that at one point during that cleanup, Kelly actually found Victoria's head, pet it, and said that she looks beautiful and like a doll. This detail was brought up during Fabian's trial. Fabian, Michelle's boyfriend, was by far the most prominent of the accused. After Michelle's charges were reduced and Jessica's plea deal was set, Fabian's fate was still in limbo. The state still charged him with reckless child harm for endangering Victoria and tampering with evidence, though they had dropped the more serious murder and sexual violence counts. Prosecutors contended that Fabian's actions, leaving Victoria with Jessica, ignoring her well-being, and then helping cover up the crime, made him criminally responsible for her death too. Fabian's 3-week trial began on July 11, 2022. The prosecution focused on the evidence of Fabian's recklessness. They portrayed him as the man who, quote, took Victoria from her mother to feed Michelle's drug habit, leaving her in danger, end quote. Witnesses described Fabian's attitude. He showed no emotion about Victoria's death and even claimed that Victoria loved him as he reviewed the evidence. The state emphasized that Fabian had been the man of the house, and when he walked away to deal drugs that night, he abandoned his parental duty, if you can even call him that. The defense responded by shifting blame back to Kelly and to John Doe, arguing that Fabian himself never harmed Victoria. The trial saw many emotional moments. Detective Christopher Enyart, one of the first officers on the scene, wept on the stand as he recounted crawling into the bathroom and seeing Victoria's body. Jessica Kelly, cross-examined by Fabian's lawyer, stuck to her plea narrative. She reiterated that an unknown man had killed Victoria and she herself could not identify him. She even claimed that there had also been 3 others in the apartment, which is a whole other conspiracy that we're not going to go into. Have any of you wondered at this point if she hallucinated parts of her testimony? Like we touched on in the Richard Chase case, when someone is mentally ill, your reality is very real to you. Similar to being mentally ill, when you're under a substance like methamphetamine, it can cause hallucinations. This has crossed my mind many times throughout this case. How can we really rely on the testimony of someone under the influence? In the hospital, we can't have someone sign consent forms if they've had any medications in their system that impairs their judgment or memory. So I think that's why this concern keeps coming up for me. I digress though. Fabian insisted that he had been out of harm's way. He testified that he owned up to doing drugs with Kelly, but denied any knowledge of Victoria's murder. Despite the defense's efforts, the evidence swayed the jury. On August 1st, after 11 hours of deliberating, they found Fabian guilty on all counts: reckless child harm resulting in death, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to tamper. In their verdict, jurors unanimously agreed that Fabian's neglect and subsequent cover-up made him as culpable as if he had been present at the killing. He showed no visible reaction in court when they gave him this guilty verdict. Sentencing then came on October 27th of that same year. Judge Cindy Leos, the same judge who had presided over Michelle's case, handed Fabian Gonzalez a 37.5-year prison term. This was essentially the max for the crimes that he had been convicted of. The judge specifically noted that if Fabian had not been there to enable the crime, Victoria might still be alive. Fabian was allowed credit for his time already served, but this was just symbolic. He will spend decades also behind bars. In making her ruling, Judge Leos echoed the community's anguish, saying that she believed Fabian had placed Victoria in the terrible situation that led to her death. He is now, as of late 2022, serving his sentence at the New Mexico prison in Santa Fe. He is eligible for parole after half his term, around age 50. Fabian's conviction closed one chapter of the legal saga, but not the entire story. Unlike Jessica, he was determined to appeal. In late 2024, the state appeal court announced that it would review his conviction, not because of new facts, but to ensure that legal procedures were correctly followed. The conviction of Fabian, despite the presence of an unknown killer, affirmed the message: anyone who knowingly leaves a child in harm's way bears responsibility. By the summer of 2018, Michelle Martens had effectively gone from principal suspect to a somewhat sympathetic figure. It was revealed that she, along with others, had allowed her daughter to be exploited, but by June 29th of 2018, she admitted that she was not the murderer. In a courtroom packed with family, Michelle quietly accepted a plea bargain to one count of reckless child harm, resulting in her death. Her tearful plea acknowledged that she had failed to protect Victoria and had given misleading statements, but she insisted she did not physically harm her daughter. Insert eye roll here. For this plea, the state recommended a reduced sentence. In November 22, after watching what had happened to the other two suspects, Michelle was finally sentenced by Judge Leos. The judge imposed a 12-year prison term, but gave her a 6-year credit like I mentioned earlier. The judge's remarks were compassionate but firm. She acknowledged Michelle's efforts at self-improvement in jail and the love that Michelle possessed for her children, but also stressed that Victoria's death could not be ignored. In court, Michelle sat expressionless as family members wept over Victoria. The prosecution urged a harsh penalty, while the defense emphasized that Michelle had no prior record and had even worked hard on drug treatment while in prison. Ultimately, Judge Leos credited all time served and did not award Michelle any additional good time, meaning Michelle will be behind bars till 2028. As she left the courtroom, Michelle hugged her parents, Victoria's grandparents, who had supported her throughout the entire ordeal. So, 3 primary adults in Victoria's life all received sentences. Jessica Kelly got 44 years, Fabian got 37, and Michelle got 12 with 6 years credit. Think about how crazy this is, though. The only person charged with Victoria's actual murder, the unidentified John Doe, has never been apprehended. The judge in Michelle's case reminded the courtroom that even as those present received consequences, authorities remained at work. A partial DNA profile of a man found in Victoria's body had been the only one charged with her murder, and the hunt is still on to find him. Victoria Martens' murder also shines a spotlight on critical failures in New Mexico's child protection and law enforcement systems. In the aftermath, many experts and officials asked, could this have been prevented? The answer that emerged was that multiple agencies did meet their legal obligations, yet the laws and policies in place allowed such abuse to slip through the cracks. To begin, consider the child welfare system, CYFD. CYFD received 5 reports about the Martens household dating back to 2015. Each report was investigated thoroughly by the workers who interviewed both Victoria and her brother, but found no evidence of abuse at the time. Former CYFD Secretary Monique Jacobson later insisted that the social workers had done everything complete and thorough by the rules. Their internal audit later confirmed that staff had followed procedures and had, in their view, done nothing wrong. However, critics pointed out the very legal definitions that contradicted that. Under New Mexico law, CYFD could only investigate if a caretaker had harmed the child. When the March 2016 tip came in that someone had tried to kiss Victoria, the department deemed it outside of their jurisdiction and passed it on to the police. In other words, the law said unless a guardian injures a child, CYFD is powerless. The Albuquerque Police Department acknowledged their mistakes. A review later found that the APD did not properly handle referrals from the CYFD when they needed to. In fact, a police spokesman had actually lied to a newspaper, claiming APD had investigated the March 2016 incident. The oversight agency concluded that the department actually did not investigate that referral. The report noted that APD's handling was inadequate. APD leaders defended themselves by saying that the attempted kiss wasn't criminal, but according to the public, this is a failure of common sense. The grandparents of Victoria even filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the city, alleging negligence because of this. That suit, which sought policy changes, was eventually dismissed, but it underlined how many people in the city felt that Victoria had been let down long before her murder. This is a pattern that we see a lot in these cases. Lives that are senselessly lost because of the ball being dropped. When is it going to stop? I hate that it takes devastating events like this to create change in the system, but it did. Victoria's case became a catalyst. In 2017 to 2018, New Mexico's leaders held news conferences, commissioned hearings, and legislative sessions asking themselves, did the system fail Victoria? Attorney General Hector Balderas bluntly said her murder raised more questions than answers and directly asked whether state institutions were at fault or not. Democratic Senator Michael Padilla, who chairs the Senate Judiciary Committee, spearheaded a bill to create an interagency panel to review child violence-related deaths statewide, citing Victoria's case as a driving example. Even Governor Victoria Martens, the state's chief executive at the time, publicly called for a federal investigation into the killing. Community advocates and Victoria's own family joined the call. Victoria's godmother, Reverend Laura Bobbs, told legislators that the children of New Mexico, quote, have a voice and that voice is ours, working together as a community to end these tragedies, end quote. Citizen petitions such as change.org garnered tens of thousands of signatures demanding justice for Victoria and stricter child protection laws. On city streets and at the state capitol, vigils with balloons, teddy bears, and flowers sprung up wherever people needed to grieve her. Victoria Martens' story exposed gaps in the safety net that we often talk about going missed. Laws too narrow, the no-crime loophole, interagency communications, or lack thereof, and reliance on caseworkers with overwhelming caseloads. The response was a rare moment of political will in New Mexico. Children's advocates argued that every death of a child must be thoroughly reviewed, leading to new legislation aimed at oversight and accountability. Had any one of these failures been caught in time, perhaps Victoria might have been saved. Instead, her death served as a costly warning to fix the system for other children so that this doesn't happen ever again. The outrage over Victoria's death was felt everywhere. Albuquerque Police Chief Gordon Eden called it the most gruesome act of evil I have ever seen in my career. Governor Martinez, a former prosecutor, said that Victoria's slaying was the most horrific crime his state has ever seen. Then Mayor Richard Berry tweeted, "We are heartbroken as we mourn the murder of a beautiful 10-year-old girl named Victoria Martens. Give your kids an extra tight hug tonight." The neighborhood where Victoria lived was especially impacted by her murder. Within days, neighbors and strangers began leaving stuffed animals and flowers and balloons near the apartment's building entrance, creating a makeshift shrine for Victoria. On August 29th, just 6 days after her death, students at Petroglyph Elementary, her school, and dozens of community members gathered at a sunset for a balloon release in her memory. Strangers posted flyers on lampposts, "Missing precious child, reward, justice, have you seen her smile?" The hashtag Justice for Victoria trended on local social media. 2 months later, on October 29th, the community held a public funeral and celebration of life for Victoria. Hundreds filled the chapel, many wearing bright clothes or holding yellow balloons, her favorite color. Teachers spoke of her kindness. Her grandparents spoke of lost dreams. Even the prosecutor, Raul Torres, had spent hours explaining every evidence detail, expressed that, quote, "We owe it to Victoria to get this right," end quote. He was moved by this, and that says a lot because it's really rare to see a DA speak up so personally on a public matter. Victoria's murder also stimulated action beyond Albuquerque. New Mexico's lawmakers passed a bill creating a task force to review future child harm-related deaths, requiring cross-agency cooperation. Community groups formed Victoria's Voice, hosting support networks for families of victims. Annual memorials on August 23rd have continued. Each year, family and activists leave new flowers at the balloon tree that they planted by the Martens apartment. Even state courts now refer to the Martens case whenever discussing negligence. In a 2021 Supreme Court ruling, justices mentioned Victoria's grandparents' wrongful death lawsuit against the city. As of 2025, the search for Victoria's killer, John Doe, is still ongoing. The Albuquerque Police Department periodically receives tips, and crime labs have continued to hold on to that DNA sample, but now all we can do is watch and wait. Now, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, we have an interview that I need to share with you. Today's case recommendation came from a former CYFD social worker in New Mexico. For privacy reasons, I'm going to leave her information out of this, but I'm going to share with you now some of what she shared with me. She begins by sharing about her love of true crime and saying that she is an avid true crime watcher, and that's kind of what led her here to us. But then she goes on to say, "I am a clinical social worker. My career spans from working with perinatal to geriatric. I worked in early intervention with adults with developmental disabilities and traditional outpatient counseling for children, adults, and couples. as well as inpatient services in mental health hospitals with acute individual diagnoses with extreme psychosis. This range of experience continued to provide me opportunities to think about the question, what makes an individual commit such devious and horrible acts towards others? After 5 years post-graduation, I became an administrator and began supporting children and families in the State Agency for Children Protection and Family Services. I focused on my experience, my instinct with wanting to be an advocate, and on reducing negative childhood outcomes through my role as an administrator. I wanted to be a part of the conversation and ability to work with legislation to pass laws to protect children from harm that could create long-term outcomes of involvement in the legal system or irreversible psychosis. Then I asked her about her experience with the case. August 25th, 2016, 9 a.m. Information, loss of life of child. Manner of death, homicide caused by strangulation. Additional information, cruelty to body, and cruelty to corpse. A high-level form of information was beginning to be shared across the Children and Family Division, so the CYFD that we've been talking about, on the morning of August 24th, 2016. Details of how Victoria passed had not been fully disclosed at this point. We did get information that the child had suffered beyond imaginable torture, suffering from her trusted adults, and questions about the system and its involvement. Administrative personnel were informed that there's an investigation and referred media inquiries to the Public Information Officer. The message at the onset was that the department would conduct a thorough investigation alongside law enforcement and prepare a response. This was the beginning of my personal and professional ethics and the implications that it could have on my license. As a nurse, I completely understand that. My license in social work is one that I protect, and I will not bend my ethical oath to the career to protect an agency's image. Agreed. It is important to note that from January 2015 to December 2018, the Secretary of the Children, Youth, and Families Division did not have a background in childhood services. During the Governor Susan Martinez's administration years, she selected loyal workers. Cabinet Secretary Monique Jacobson was a loyal worker. She served as New Mexico's Tourism Cabinet Secretary. Governor Martinez aimed to rebrand CYFD to improve its negative perception in the state due to persistent failures in protecting children and supporting families. The Pull It Together campaign then started. Administrators from all sectors of the Children, Youth, and Family Division traveled around the state to promote this initiative, aiming to connect with children, families, and agencies to reduce abuse and neglect in the state. Despite spending over $3 million, the campaign never sustained and is no longer discussed in the community. Concerns of government funds being allocated to CYFD image and not improving caseworkers for families with children were an ongoing discussion at the state and local levels. Wow, I could see that. From the discussion of Victoria Martens, I personally and professionally began to question CYFD's true commitment to protecting children. I continued as the state administrator in the department to support families and children. However, I began to become keenly aware of how the system is set up to protect the highest administrators by sacrificing lower administrators when such a case as Victoria Martens is making the state news. I was focused from that point forward on obtaining as many resources for protecting our children from the time of conception to when they entered the school system. It became my mission to seek funding and resources to support all the dedicated agencies working in that domain to have qualified staff and knowledgeable managers who would support these staff. I managed to renew state grants through the U.S. and Health Department services to secure federal funding for infant mental health. Wow, that's amazing. Childcare and home visiting. My last grant application requested funding to ensure that all providers in early childhood settings, home or agency daycares, would be able to receive necessary certification at no cost to the individual. Receiving the funding was an amazing feeling. My letdown was that the money was reallocated to go towards the Pull It Together campaign. Oh, that's terrible. This was my cue to leave the state, as I could not support the money going towards a fancy campaign and not towards ensuring any staff in any sector of CYFD was not directly receiving funding to support increase in certifications, recruitment for qualified staff, and increasing staff in critical areas as child welfare and abuse investigations. That right there tells you guys how understaffed they were. I continued to receive updates on Victoria Martens' case, plus the daily losses of children across the state. It was traumatic to see the state losses of children in 24 hours. It was shocking, and I felt that I was becoming numb to seeing the losses. I had developed compassion fatigue, where somewhere along the way, I felt that it was due to hearing about the number of children's lives that were lost across the state, and the majority of them could have been prevented. This was my cue to leave the toxicity of government and wanting to rejoin the world of child well-being advocacy. After leaving CYFD, I worked with an agency that focused on trauma-informed clinical counseling. I concentrated on assisting families involved in severe incidents of child abuse, neglect, abandonment, and reunification. The Victoria Martens case inspired me to seek this specialized clinical work, especially after reading her autopsy report, which we touched on, and that was devastating. I asked her about potential gaps in the system and improvements that have been implemented since the case. Working for the state proved challenging. I appreciated the experience, but found the bureaucracy and politics challenging to navigate. I was a social advocate and had no problem speaking my mind. This went against the status quo for working with a government agency. I decided to focus on trauma work for children. It was the Victoria Martens case that broke me and continued to haunt me. I met with the director of Children, Youth, and Families about a crucial case. In hindsight, I regret calling this a significant case. Describing this child's life as a case was unfortunate. The disconnect was so shocking. That meeting transformed my life by revealing Victoria's experiences. A precious 10-year-old life was minimized to being labeled a case. New Mexico continues to fall to 50th in the nation for child well-being. Wow. The continuous revolving door of administrators, caseworkers, investigators, and insufficient funding is what is hindering the department's ability to protect children. There are not enough qualified workers to meet the needs of the enormous number of child neglect and abuse calls made. Additionally, through my experience at the state agency, it was really shocking to see how departments did not communicate with one another. And that's crazy because we talked about this, you guys. If there was a case on a child for neglect, then the child was referred again, and that information would take a long time to get to the caseworker assigned. Another baby has been lost in the system due to parental drug use. This case does highlight the many issues that remain in CYFD. All I can say is, wow. Thank you so much for sharing your story with us regarding the CYFD and your experience there. I know how painful this case was for you, and it means a lot to me that you suggested Victoria's story and opened up to us. Victoria Martens continues to influence the conversation on how a community needs to protect its most vulnerable people. Each August and October, flowers and notes at the apartments that she used to live in speak to a community that still deeply cares for her. School children now hear her name in discussions of heroism and tragedy. And in the halls of Albuquerque's courthouse, every plea and verdict in the Martens case was closely observed as a tragic lesson on justice, compassion, and the heavy human cost when systems fail a child. In the end, the story of Victoria is the story of a little girl who loved life and wasn't given the love that she needed in return, and her death awakened an entire city and state to change. She is a testament that so many people remember her as a sweet and happy child, not just a murder victim. I hope that Victoria is resting peacefully and enjoying endless amounts of birthday cake and love that she should have had during her short time here on Earth. I know that this case is really painful and heavy, so please take a break, go get some fresh air, hug your loved ones, and know that I am so grateful for each and every one of you for being here with me and allowing me to tell these victim stories. I hope you feel loved and cared for in this crazy world, and if no one has told you this today, I appreciate you. Please be sure to take extra good care of yourselves this week. Nurse's orders. I'll see you next time. Bye, guys.